Welcome to Weaving in Ends, possibly knitting's least loved activity, but I'm hoping that by sharing these two methods of doing this with you, you'll find them a little bit easier to sew in. I'm going to refer to them as methods 1 and 2 as they don't have any specific names. I use both of them. I use method 1 most frequently, and method 2 I use if I am sewing in the middle of a row. I'll show you both and then you can decide which you would prefer for yourself. So welcome to option 1 for sewing in your ends. I use this method vertically when I'm doing it on stocking stitch because I find it really easy to hide. I also use it at the edges of garments and for ribs and everything. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew in my tail onto the purl bumps of my stocking stitch piece. The first thing to do is to thread your darning needle, and I do that by folding over my thread rather than going towards the end of it and risking splitting the yarn at the end. I just find it a little bit easier to go through the eye of the needle that way. But it's absolutely personal preference. Once you've threaded your needle, I turn it over to the back of the work and I look for the purl bumps that I'm going to hide the tail in. So here I'm going to go in a little bit from the edge because I want to go into the purl bumps of the first piece of the rib. So I find the first bump that I'm going to go through, which is along the cast on edge. And you do this quite gently. There's no need to pull or anything like that. Just make it look a little bit like a stitch at the back of the work. Now you're not going to go in and out between the purl bumps, even though that's really tempting. First of all, it's a little bit too slippery. And the second reason is that it can be visible on the front side of the work. Instead, what you are doing is very slowly and gently taking your needle through and splitting the threads of the purl bumps at the back of the work. As you can see, I'm picking up maybe 1 or 2 of the plies of yarn here and going through those very gently. And that is where I'm going to pull my tail through in just a moment. It's one of the only times I'm going to tell you to split stitches. And the reason you do that is because as you pull through, the split of the stitches will hold your tail a little bit better in place. So how far in do you weave? I would weave in somewhere between 1 inch and 1.5 inches. Anything else is a little bit excessive and adding additional weight to your garment. Once you've weaved in about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, I turn the work and I go back the other way, and this is to prevent the work pulling out. Now you'll see here that you have done exactly the same and gone down through the purl bumps the other side. Now as you come out, you leave yourself that little bit of space so that when you pull it, it pulls them both really nicely in. It also means that you don't get any puckering. So you can see that it is completely invisible and it's completely hidden in the backs of the work. So what you do now is you just clip off your end and then you give a little fluff using either your needle or your scissors to the very end of the tail, and what that does is it prevents it from slipping back, and over time, if you're using particularly a wool fibre, it'll felt into the garment and become part of it. You will see some methods where a knot is used at this point, and that is entirely up to you, but I don't use a knot as I don't find them necessary. But if you like the extra security of one, you can overweave your yarn. But I would give this a go without a knot first. We're now going to see the same method used on garter stitch. And in garter stitch, I prefer to do this horizontally rather than vertically because of the structure of the knitting. So in this, you're actually looking for the space between your garter stitch ridges. And they are across the stitches. So as you'll have seen the purl bumps, this time we're going to be splitting the backs of the stitches. And again, you're not going to go in and out between them as if you were seaming them together. You're going to very gently take little strands of the yarns at the backs of the stitches. And again, this means that the thread won't be seen at the front of the work and it'll be held securely between the strands of yarn. So as we spoke about previously, you will go in about 1 inch to 1.5 inches and then pull your yarn through very gently. No need to pull too tightly. As we said in the previous clip, you're just trying to hide that nicely in at the back of the work. There's no need to pull it in and distort your work in any way, and by giving it a little pull as well, you mean you've plenty of flexibility in it when it's being worn. So if you feel like you need a little bit more, you can go in as well. And then, as we saw in the previous one, you turn the work. Now this time you're not going to come down the other row beside it, you're going to come down along the same dip as well. So the same space between the garter stitch bumps, you're just going to come over slightly further to the side. And as with the previous piece, you're not going to come all the way, you're just going to come maybe a quarter of an inch to half an inch along the edge of that. And then as you pull it through, you give yourself that little tiny tail as well. It's the little bit of space that you leave yourself at the turn. And then you're going to pull it through again, and that gives you, it pulls both in different directions, both sides of the weave. And then you can see that you can't see it at all from the front, as it's sitting quite at the back of the stitches. So then you take your scissors, snip off the end, and again, as we did previously, we're going to fluff up the tip of the yarn tail. And again, what that does is it'll hide it into the work over time, and it also means that it won't pull back through the stitches as well, because it's wider than the main piece of the tail. And there you have it, all neatly sewn in and not in the least bit visible. This is another method of weaving in your ends. I think of this as being a little bit like Swiss darning on the wrong side. You are essentially following around the strands of yarn of a set of stitches on the wrong side and hiding your thread essentially behind those. So when you look at them from the front, you can't see them. It's done ever so slightly differently on garter stitch and stocking stitch, in that in garter stitch you're going along both bumps and ignoring the stitch in the center between them, and in garter stitch you're following the thread of a single row of stitches, but we'll see both of those as we go. So once you've threaded your needle, what you're going to do is you're going to pick two garter stitch bumps that you're going to follow the stitches through. So you see the top and the bottom of those garter ridges, and then the first thing is to get your needle into position kind of between them. So you'll see here that I'm going to go down beside them, and then I'm going to come up from below, coming up through the first upward facing bump on the thing. So I'm going to go in here underneath, and then I'm going to come up to the right of that, and underneath my needle in those you will see a thread of yarn. So I'm actually following that stitch all the way around. Now I'm going to go over the top of the upper thread, and then I'm going to follow that down underneath so that it goes in through that bump, back through the one I came up through first, and then it's going to come through the two of the garter stitch ridges, sit on top of the thread at the top of it, and then it's going to come round underneath, as you'll see here, just underneath that it's going to sit on top of that, so it follows it into the bumps. And you are not following the whole of the stitch around the front, because that's how you would do it in stocking stitch, but you follow it up as if it was the whole stitch through the two garter ridges, and then you come back down again following that line of those stitches again. And it can take a little while to get used to, but what you're looking for is you're seeing the pattern between how you see the yarns. So again, here you can see the downward bump of the stitch. You're following it up to become an upper stitch, so as it turns down, as it circles around the top, then you're coming back down again through it, following it. And you can see as you go how it creates the curves of the garter stitch bumps at the back of the work. And it just follows those along. You can see how neatly it sits in on top of them. And we'll see in a minute how this is different for stocking stitch, because you have a different pattern of bumps at the back of the work. So again, you're going downwards mirroring the top of the stitch and then around the bottom of it. And as you can see, it's entirely invisible from the front because your yarn has been threaded through the very back of the stitches. And again, if you were finishing this off, you would snip it, fluff up the edge, and you'd be ready to go. I want to show you this method in a real life example because I find this really useful. So here I was changing between balls of yarn. I'm working in the round, so I didn't have a chance to do it at the side of a piece of work. Instead I did it under the arm. So what I want to do now is I want to, as best I can, hide these without creating a hole between them. So what you're looking for here, a little bit like the garter stitch, but not quite because the pattern of stitches is obviously different, is you are looking for the way in which this yarn becomes a stitch. So the ups and downs of it as it goes along the piece of work. So you can see it travelling in and out between the bumps at the back of the work. And this yarn isn't the clearest to see it in, but it's the best real life example that I have. So what you're going to be doing here is you're going to be taking the thread and you're going to work it in behind the thread on the left as if it were still part of the yarn. And this is very neat because it's a great way to close the hole that you would get otherwise. So I don't knit my two yarns together, I leave them alone. And then I'm going to work in over the top of the other thread and follow the pattern of it as I go. So I'm going to go up from the bottom because that is where the yarn would have gone if I hadn't cut in the yarn essentially there. So I go up from the bottom, and as with the garter stitch I'm going around the top of the stitch again and coming down. You loop around following the thread again, you go back up and around. You do this quite gently because you are really trying to avoid creating any pucker in the fabric at all here. You just want it to sit at the back of the work really tidily. Again, you're going to go down from the top, back into the one you came up through. And as you can see, it has just essentially vanished into the work. So it's not ideal for showing, but it is a good, it shows you how it does vanish into the work at the back. And this yarn is also not a superwash yarn, so it's got quite a bit of halo. And it will eventually eat the other yarn and it'll settle into it as it felts together with wear. So then once you've woven in kind of a good piece of it, you want to have a look at the front end to see how it's going. So you can turn your work around and you will see that it's quite difficult to see where you are. The only thing that's left is the little hole, and that's going to be fixed when I take the other strand across the other side of it. So you can see that it's pretty invisible. It does make it thicker because you are hiding an additional strand of yarn, and this is an Aran weight yarn, but you really can't see it that much. So now you're going to take the other thread and go the other direction. So you're going to go from the bottom and top and around the top of the stitch. And as you'll see, this is going over the work where we went the other direction, and you're closing the little hole on the other side as you do this. And that just brings the yarns together. And this is my favorite method of closing gaps that you might have when you've changed balls, particularly if you've had to do it in the center of a row. I like this because it's essentially backward Swiss darning, as I've said previously. And you can actually see how invisible it is because it's actually quite tricky to see it when it's in the same color thread as the one you're doing it with. You then continue until you've probably sewed in about an inch on both sides. And as we saw in the previous methods, You'll just clip off your ends, fluff up the tails, and it'll eventually become part of your garment. And now we're going to take a quick look at what this looks like on the other side. It's really quite discreet. You've sealed the little hole between the two and you've hidden the tails of the yarn. And while this method is really good where you have, where you're introducing a new ball, it's equally as good and you can follow the stitches in the very same way if you're just weaving a single thread into a piece of stocking stitch as well. So we're just going to look at where you have a very multicolored edge and you have a lot of threads to sew in. The first thing I would say is that in some patterns it is possible to modify them so that you are not changing colours on the same side every time, and if that is possible I definitely recommend it. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we do the September knit along, because there is a blanket pattern that requires you to do large stripes in that. I don't want you to have to sew in all on one end. But for now, because I've already done this blanket, I'm going to show you how I use the two different methods, vertical and horizontal, to try to avoid creating too much lumpiness in one area of the blanket. It can be tempting to do them all in the same way, but you're dictated to by where you have enough space to go into. So you can either go horizontally or vertically, depending on your own choice. So you're trying to avoid a situation whereby you are either interfering with your open work, so here you'll see there's some yarn overs, or you're also trying to avoid kind of building too many up on top of one another. So you kind of pick the best direction that suits you best. I don't use the over sewing method on something like this because I find that it thickens the fabric along it too much, so I find it better to sit it in between the ridges where possible. So now I want to use the other piece, but because of the way the open work is at the bottom of that, so the same thread in the same area, I don't want to go across the white of the center bars, but I'm also watching for the open work. So in this case I'm going to go vertically. But I'm not going to go vertically along the very side edge because I've already carried yarn up along there. So I'm actually going to come in a series of bumps before I do that. And as with the stocking stitch, you can work the garter stitch up and down as well. So you can do that through the bumps going vertically as well as going across the backs of stitches horizontally. So you can use both methods in garter stitch. And again, it's about distributing them through the work so that they're not all kind of piled up on one another and it doesn't create any extra thickness. So you just go through the purl bumps, turn at the top, come back down, and again then fluff up your yarn. Now I'm definitely not going to sit here and make you watch me as I sew in the rest of the ends of this blanket. However, I hope you enjoyed these tutorials and that these methods help you make a little bit more peace with sewing in your tails, because once you find that peace with them, it makes your knitting life a whole lot easier.